All right, let's take a look at chapter 11. Here's our first image, and here's the lecture preview. We'll take each one individually, starting with the first one here about the Old South. Here is your focus question. By 1820, slavery was an old institution in America. With abolition in the northern states, the peculiar institution of slavery became unique to the South. By the Civil War, the enslaved population had increased to nearly 4 million, and slavery had spread to Arkansas, Louisiana, and eastern Texas. Enslaved people were one-third of the South's entire population and half of the population in the cotton states of the Deep South. Slavery's expansion was due to the growth of cotton production, which replaced sugar as the world's major slave crop. Though slavery persisted in Brazil and the Caribbean, Britain's abolition of slavery within its empire in 1833 made the U.S. slavery's center in the hemisphere. The Old South was the largest and most powerful slave society in history, based on the region's virtual monopoly on cotton. Cotton's use in textile manufacturing made it central to the Industrial Revolution in Europe and America and the most important commodity in international trade. By 1860, investments in enslaved people exceeded in value the worth of all of the nation's factories, railroads, and banks combined. To replace the foreign slave trade that had been banned in the U.S. in 1808, a massive internal slave trade developed. More than 2 million enslaved people were sold between 1820 and 1860, many of whom were transported to the Deep South to new cotton plantations. Virtually every slave owner at some point bought and sold enslaved people. The Cotton Kingdom could not have developed without the internal slave trade, and the older slave states in the East came to depend on the sale of their enslaved people. Although the northern states abolished slavery, slavery affected them nonetheless. The Constitution enhanced the power of the South in the House of Representatives and Electoral College and required all states to return fugitives from bondage. Slavery touched the lives of all Americans. Northern merchants and manufacturers participated in the slave economy and profited from it. Cotton trade profits helped finance industrial development and internal improvements in the North. Northern ships carried cotton, Northern banks financed plantations, Northern companies insured slave property, and Northern factories turned cotton into clothing. Rather than being evenly distributed throughout the South, the slave population was concentrated in areas with the most fertile soil and easiest access to national and international markets. By 1860, a significant percentage of the slave population had been transported from the Atlantic coast to the lower South via the internal slave trade. While slavery defined and dominated the South's economy, the South was a diverse region. In the Upper South, enslaved people and slave owners were a much smaller percentage of the population compared to Deep South states stretching from South Carolina to Texas. The Upper South had centers of manufacturing, while the Deep South depended entirely on cotton. Yet slavery caused the South to have a very different economic development than the North. Slavery inhibited industrial growth, discouraged immigration, and slowed technological progress. It did not have large and diverse cities as in the North, except for New Orleans. Banks and railroad lines served plantations and little else. While many in the North thought slavery prevented economic growth, slavery was, in fact, very profitable and expanded the Southern economy. The majority of Southern white families owned no enslaved people. Because planters had the best land, most white small farmers lived outside the plantation belt in areas unsuitable for cotton. They worked the land with the labor of family members, not enslaved people or wage workers. Many were self-sufficient and remote from markets. They were often desperately poor and more often illiterate than northern farmers, since most southern states lacked free public schools. In part because these farmers did not provide a market for manufactured goods, the South did not develop industry. While some poor whites resented the planters' economic and political power, most accommodated the planters and shared with them a common racial identity, business ties, common political culture, and kinship ties. Many white small farmers believed that their economic and personal freedom rested on slavery. Most slave owners did not own large plantations. In 1850, most slaveholding families owned 5 or fewer enslaved people. Only a small number of families owned more than 20 enslaved people. Even fewer owned more than 100 enslaved people. Planters' enslaved property provided wealth, status, and influence. They held the best land, had the highest incomes, and dominated local and state politics and government. Small slave owners aspired to become large planters. Planters owned enslaved people to make huge profits, and they used those profits for the conspicuous consumption of luxury goods, creating an aristocratic material life sharply at odds with life for most Northerners. Planters and overseers kept careful records of the work done by individual slaves. Plantations were part of a world market, and planters worked to accumulate land, enslaved people, and great profits, some of which they invested in railroads and banks. Planters did not celebrate competitive capitalism, but a hierarchical agrarian society in which slaveholding gentlemen took personal responsibility for the well being of their dependent women, children, and enslaved people. This outlook of paternalism had long been a feature of American slavery, but it deepened with the end of the African slave trade, which closed the cultural gap between enslaved people and owners. And most Southern slave owners lived on their own plantations close to their slaves. Paternalism obscured and justified slavery's brutality. Owners thought themselves kind and responsible even while they bought, sold, and punished their enslaved people. Over time, Southern values diverged from the North's culture of egalitarianism, competition, and individualism. In the South, men of all classes followed a code of personal honor in which they were expected to defend the reputation of themselves and their families, with violence if necessary. Dueling, while illegal, was not uncommon. Southern white women were even more confined to the home and the domestic ideal than Northern women. In the 30 years before the Civil War, pro-slavery thought came to dominate Southern intellectual and cultural life. Fewer Southern whites felt, as had many founding fathers, that slavery was a necessary evil, and more started to argue it was a positive good. Racism, the belief that blacks were innately inferior to whites and suited for slavery, framed the pro-slavery argument. Slave owners also found justification for slavery in ancient history and the Bible. Some Southerners argued that black slavery guaranteed equality for whites by preventing the growth of a white working class in the South. Slavery, they argued, provided the economic autonomy and independence that the North's industrial workers lacked and that formed the basis of the Republic. Southern slaveholders knew of the Haitian Revolution, other slave rebellions, and British abolition. Emancipation throughout the Americas strongly shaped debates about slavery and its future in the United States. While American slave owners argued that emancipation had been a failure, abolitionists disagreed. By 1850, slave systems remained in the Western Hemisphere only in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and the United States. Nonetheless, the massive growth of the slave population in the Old South meant there were more enslaved people in the hemisphere in 1860 than at any prior time. Many white Southerners claimed they were the true inheritors of the Revolution's legacy, and they freely used the language of liberty to compare their condition to slavery. They complained that government interference with their economy threatened to enslave them. Southern state constitutions acknowledged equal rights for free white men, but in the 1830s, some pro-slavery writers began to argue that liberty, equality, and democracy were not necessarily beneficial to the South. South Carolina, in particular, was home to many who argued that freedom and equality were not universal entitlements, even for all whites. When sectionalism intensified after 1830, more Southern writers and politicians came to defend slavery not as ensuring equality between whites, but as the basis of an organic, hierarchical society in which white large planters ruled over lesser whites and enslaved people. George Fitzhugh, a Virginian, took this argument to the extreme, repudiating Jeffersonian ideals and the idea of America's world mission to spread freedom. He argued that slavery, not liberty, was the normal basis of civilization in world history, and argued that enslaved people were happy and contented. He suggested that white workers in the North and South should have paternal white owners to care for them rather than be enslaved by capitalist markets and employers. So that's the end of section 1. We'll come to section 2 next.